Welcome back to the Flex Diet Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Mike T. Nelson. On this podcast, we talk about all things to increase muscle performance, improve body composition, and do all of it without destroying your health in the process. Today, we've got some very special guests who have been on the podcast before. We've got Dr. Kelly Starrett and Juliet Starrett back on the podcast here. And what I wanted to do with this one is, this is a very special excerpt from the Flex Diet Virtual Metabolism Summit. Go to www.flexdietsummit.com. We'll put a link below here. This is going on online this coming February 9th through the 12th, 2024. Go to flexdietsummit.com. February 9th through the 12th. And when you opt in there, you'll be able to get access to all of the speakers for free. The catch is, as there always is a catch to it, that you will only be able to see them for free that weekend. We will have an offer that you can purchase the downloads of all of them if you would like, but you don't have to. You can go there, you can see all the presentations for free. We've got over 30 presentations lined up. Everyone from Lee Boyce to Dr. Lonnie Lowry, Dr. Susan Kleiner, Jeb Johnson, Dr. Lisa Lewis, Brad Pilon, Luca Hosevar, Dan John, Allie Gilbert, Joel Jameson, Dr. John Mike, Dr. Jed Tata, Adam Ross, Brian Cron, many more than that. Go there and you can get access to all of them for free. So in this podcast here, this is an excerpt from that virtual summit. And Dr. Kelly and Juliet and I talk about movement, why movement is super important, how it's related to muscle, why having a higher quality movement is going to be beneficial. How do you know what higher quality movement is? And then we also touch on recovery related to sleep, how that impacts your metabolism, and much more. So enjoy this podcast, which is an excerpt from the Flex Diet Virtual Summit with Dr. Kelly Starrett and Juliet Starrett. Thank you so much for both of you being here. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Dr. Mike.
Anything for you.
Oh, wow. Watch out. Be careful. Careful what you say. Yeah, and so for the discussion, we're talking about just aspects of movement related to metabolism. And I thought, well, both of you are experts in that area. Obviously, before we get started, make sure to plug your book first and give us the short synopsis of why you wrote it, because I think there's a ton of great stuff in there that we probably won't have time to get to in this short hour.
Sure, I'll take a crack at that, Dr. Mike.
Yeah.
We published our book last year called Built to Move, or I guess it's still this year, it's still 2023, but last year called Built to Move. And we, as had been working with high performing athletes and teams and serious athletes for most of our professional lives, but we wanted to figure out how we could distill those lessons for sort of the masses, so to speak. And also, we really spent a lot of time in the pandemic trying to figure out, like, what are the essential behaviors of a human that are realistic, that busy people can actually do, and how do all those behaviors integrate with one another? And what was really working for us, the things that we were actually doing on a day-to-day basis that weren't like the latest health and fitness fad, that are the things that we've, as two busy working parents, what are the things that we've really realistically been able to do and implement in our lives that have really moved the levers the most for us? And so we really tried to sort of put all those together into one book and make it fun. There are tests for every single chapter so people can sort of get a sense of where they are. And we just wanted to make it accessible.
Let me double click on that, because one of the things that I think around health and fitness that we don't have clear necessarily in sort of our brains is this notion of sort of objective measures and vital signs. And I think around nutrition, we're definitely getting better. We can look at blood panels, we can count things, we can measure your body fat and your inflammation markers. It gets a lot easier, but some of these other behaviors, we haven't really given people clear guidelines. And certainly around movement, we never ever created vital signs around minimums. What we saw in the pandemic, as Juliet said, was that people got really comfortable with SaO2 and some of these other markers. And people are looking at heart rate variability now as sort of a, a metric that's thrown around our office, which is crazy. And yet, literally, I'm like, well, how much should your hip be able to move? And then people are like, some, a little. Well, it doesn't hurt, so it's good enough.
Yeah, or just something basic. Can I get up and down off the ground?
That's right.
Something as basic as that, which people take for granted, but just these simple benchmarks.
Yeah, and I think when we give people benchmarks, then it allows us to come up and down sort of and self-test. And what Juliet and I have come to appreciate is, and you know better than anyone, there are a lot of ways to eat. And based on your culture, based on your genetics, based on your preferences. And boy, if I just give a bunch of steak to a bunch of women in my life, and that's the only thing, probably not going to have the same outcome as handing a bunch of steak to a 14-year-old boy. The idea here is we really end up being agnostic about the way you like to move, the things that you like to do in your community, the way you want to manage these things. But let's go ahead and just test them against some objective third-party measurements that are well-validated and clinically relevant. And we can see where you are. And I think when people have that information, then they can tune up and tune down. And also it helps us to appreciate that, hey, I haven't been eating any fiber for the last week. Whoops, I've been traveling. Maybe I need to come back up because I haven't had any fruits and vegetables.
And one last thing I'll add, Dr. Mike, is that a lot of people go and get a physical every year with their primary care physician, but the physical isn't really physical anymore. I mean, there's the occasional physician who's doing some little physical test or some kind of balance test or something, but it sort of lacks anything physical anymore. And that really is a missing piece. And we all know that we want to be able to retain our movement capability for as long as we live. And so it was sort of interesting to us. That's not something that's tested. So our hope with this book is it like sits on your coffee table, and every 3 or 6 months, you go back and put yourself through the test, and you basically give yourself like an at-home physical and just check in. Like, where am I? Can I get off the ground? Is my balance still intact? How's my breathing doing? Just some of these basic metrics that people can just keep visiting over and over again.
And lastly, I'll say that these are still the performance anchors, the limiters that we initiate all our conversations with our elite athletes, our world champions. Because so often people are like, just show me the secret hip mobilization so I can have better extension. And I'm like, well, we need to sort of understand the whole thing here, or why that knee pain isn't getting better. I mean, just recently we were at a concert, and a woman you could tell had struggled with some aspects of her health, and she was wearing an unloader brace. And Juliet and I had a conversation about osteoarthritis. And I just had this conversation with another physiatrist friend. Osteoarthritis is very much akin to having a metabolic disease. So which one of these things is not important? And one of the things that we've recognized and tried to do in this book is to appreciate that we are a complex system of systems. And while I'm just a physical therapist, I can't talk about your tissue health and your resiliency unless I'm talking about your sleep and your breathing and your movement and your decongestion and your nutrition. So that's how we ended up here.
No, I think that's great. And especially since my master's was in engineering, I think of you have like the boundaries of the system, and then you have your buffer zone. Like, how close to the boundaries of the system are you? Like the shoulder on the road, like how much shoulder on the road do you have before you put the car in the ditch? And unfortunately with movement stuff, as you guys know better than I do, most people don't do anything until the car is already in the ditch. It's, oh, you probably only had 1 inch of shoulder left, but it'll be fine. I'll just step on the gas harder, and then oops,
it's always
why
worked.
did it break?
Yeah.
I mean, therein lies the biggest business problem we have, Dr. Mike, in what it is we do. And that is that if we can ever crack the code of getting people to care before the car is in the ditch,
Yeah,
we will have sort of won at business. But yeah, I mean, most people do find us and find Kelly and find our work and our app and all the things we're doing at the Ready State. They find us usually when the car's in the ditch.
Or they can't do something. I don't know why.
Yeah. Car doesn't start.
Yeah, or the car doesn't start. And
right.
I mean, I think the exception to that would be high performers and professional athletes and people who actually need to, their body makes money for them. So if you need your body to make a living, that is a subset of people who tend to learn to care a little earlier. They're able to appreciate that because they need their body to pay their mortgage.
And for example, for everyone in elite level cycling, our athletes will be putting out 49% on their left leg and 51% on their right leg, and that's unacceptable. And that is something that we're working on, those tolerances. And I think one of the things that we want to do is move beyond this conversation of pain and no pain. What should the human being be able to do throughout our life? And more importantly, how does that matter to you in your community, in your family, in your job. That's really the sort of true modern definition of being mobile, right? Mobility is having access to your native capacities. So you have more movement choice and greater tissue tolerance and better application of what it is you're doing. I think where it gets confusing is we've told people, well, just go smash yourself in the gym with kettlebell swings and Peloton, and that's enough. You've checked the metabolic box and you've breathed hard. And that says nothing about your ability to scale, move, handle speed, pick up a new sport, apply these skills. So I think we can really confuse people. And the last thing that people tend to look at when they are having pain is how well am I moving? And I don't mean to have good squat technique. I mean, does your ankle or knee flex the way it's supposed to, the way every doctor says it should, every engineer says it should? Like, that's why we have these reference ranges. And somehow we've just thrown that out because in part of the physical therapy language, for example, is that all movement is good. It's all okay. It doesn't matter. And I'm like, that's true at low loads and low speeds with very low consequence. You can probably get away with murder because the body is so robust. But as soon as you want to go fast or go long or go heavy or compete or have more movement solutions, you're going to need to have access and training to those shapes.
Or how about just cut in your weekend game of pickleball?
Oh, Lord.
Oh. Oh,
Pickleball is
yeah.
why Kelly and I have a job for the rest of our life, Dr. Mike. And we're fans. We're
Yep.
fans of pickleball, but we're like, keep it coming, middle-aged people.
I'm good friends with a couple orthos who are just like, pickleball is the greatest revolution for my job, because the amount of people who go from zero to hero in one weekend, I love it on one hand, but he's on the other hand, humans are very bad at moderating, which is good for my profession.
True.
But
We
so,
are
like,
bad.
Yeah.
back
And you just think about what most of the people we know are doing. Like, speaking of Peloton, like everybody is doing most of their movement in a straight line. They're biking and
that's
they're
not
walking
even
and
Peloton, is even straight lining. That's
whatever. They're just, I don't even know what that, but you know what I'm saying?
Sagittal life.
We're not doing we're not doing anything. Most of us aren't doing anything that's like multi-directional. And then all of a sudden people, they lunge out for their huge move in their weekend pickleball gold medal match and they tear their ACL and they're like, what?
We had a friend who was very fit on the bike and went to a ski trip and had a bad ACL tear and some other trauma to the joint, and was really surprised because he was so athletic
and so fit.
Hey, I'm so fit. I can just, look at my wattage, look at my kilos to watt, look at my output, look how and we're like, how could that possibly have prepared you to weight bear at high G forces for many hours during the day? And I think that really does speak to the failure of the fitness industrial complex to say, are we treating exercise as disease state and just warding off like, hey, you're just going to get out of your car. You don't really ever going to do these things. All you need to do is be on a bike or something, right? And maybe do a plank. But then all of a sudden we're like, well, hey, the other side of that is how can we prepare people to actually be surprised or take these hits or fall or learn a new skill or pick up I think people really are shocked when they get injured playing pickleball. We've heard of torn bicep tendons playing pickleball. What I have to ask you is, how heavy is the racket that you're using? I mean, that ball, wiffle ball, weighs nothing. So if we start adding speed to that thing, well, why are your tendons? I mean, you're a human being. Why are your tendons and insertions so weak that you rip that thing off the bone, swinging your arm? That's crazy.
Yeah, it's using the car analogy again. For years in my career, I thought I would be the one that would prevent them from putting the car in the ditch, and it didn't work. And so now I'm just, can we stop when you hit those little rumble strips on the side, or can you just put it in a snowdrift? So you put it in the ditch, but just don't go off the cliff with the thing. What's the smallest mistake you can make that you'll learn from that hopefully isn't catastrophic?
That's great.
I love that.
Because trying to talk people out of it doesn't seem to work. So even like in person, I'll have somebody come in, even before an exercise session, I just do old school Kendall manual muscle testing on them. I'm not looking for anything crazy. I'm not a physical therapist. I'm just like, does your glute med do what a glute med should probably do in mid-range? That's all I care about. And I'm mainly trying to demonstrate to the person like what they're missing, like a lot of the tests you guys do. It's here's a test. Oh, wow. Because most of it is an awareness drill of, oh, I didn't know I was missing this. I didn't know I didn't have that amount of hip flexion. And now
Right.
that they're aware, hopefully they'll ask the next question of, oh, what do I do to fix it now? Oh, so glad you asked.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what we were trying to do in Built to Move, was just bring this general awareness about people's movement capability and some general health metrics to people, and then say, okay, these are ways you can improve. And that's one of the reasons we chose the things we chose, because we know that people can improve doing the things that they're all improvable things.
And in there, we at least touch all the shapes. For example, our language is that we speak in these archetypes, which are sort of bookends of key physiologic ranges. So if we talk about the shoulder is capable of mystery and magic, go to Cirque du Soleil and you can really see what shoulders can do, right?
Oh, so crazy.
Go to track and field and watch someone pole vault and you're like, okay, shoulders are pretty rad. But really, the shoulder, your arm goes up over your head. So what does that mean? Downward dog, swimming, pulling on a pull-up bar, pressing overhead, snatching. There's a lot of ways to get your arm over your head. It goes behind you in either a bent elbow or a straight elbow position. Well, that's running and that's benching and dipping, right? You suddenly, or you're rowing, you can suddenly see that's what that arm does. It goes out to your side and it can either bend or straighten and be out to your side. And that's how you would hang clean or pull something or swim, right? And what else? Oh, it goes in front of you and in a range around. And again, you can mix and match those positions. But if you're not actually touching those shapes in your training, then you are creating blind spots for yourself. And so what we're asked to come in and evaluate people's programming, elite Olympians programming. What are we missing? Why are we having this problem? Well, let me give you a good example. We have seen in our Olympic lifting communities, people going to the Olympics, the best Olympic lifters in the world will have knee pain or occult back pain that they can't wrap their heads around. And so what we do is we say, oh, it must be that you're not strong enough. You only squat 300
You're
kilos.
only world champion,
Yeah.
right?
So
Yeah.
we just suddenly remove this strength issue because it can't be that, right? And what we end up looking at is, well, let's go ahead and look and make sure that the training that you're doing is at least not robbing some key physiologic ranges. And what we find usually is that most of those athletes are actually very deficient in hip extension. That means getting the knee. Juliet's laughing because it's my
You know
favorite
what?
talk
You know
about.
what? Dr. Mike Kelly has been waiting to try to figure out when in this conversation he could talk about hip extension, because it's
Oh,
his
yeah.
favorite subject. And he's so excited right now that
Go
he's
for
teed
it.
himself up for it.
So a lot of people think that they're working on hip extension when they do glute raises, right? So you're a Brett Contreras guy, you love the hip thrust, and I agree, it's great. What fine, you love that thing, but your hip actually doesn't go into extension. It goes from flexion like a squat into mid-range neutral, like when standing. But the leg is bent, so you think you're doing all this work. But if we see the single leg squatting varieties that most people do, the back leg is just a balance point and it's more single leg squatting. They actually haven't loaded that back leg. If you look at the work of Stuart McMillan of Altus,
Yep.
Franz Bosch, what's going on over there, Bosch Systems, you're seeing that more and more people are really beginning to recognize we better do more things in split stance. We better load that back leg in extension. And that's the reason why we see so many Achilles tears. We're not competent in that back range. We turn the foot out. We don't have a good system. We haven't loaded those tissues. There's your Achilles. That's your plantar fascial problem. That's your knee pain. So when we end up loading people in those positions, and it might just be, hey, we need to do some isometrics and a Bulgarian split squat at the end of the session, that tissue exposure back there suddenly reminds us, oh, I should have this access. Maybe there's a tissue restriction that's preventing me because I'm doing all this squatting and jerking. And suddenly pain goes away. And more importantly, hip function improves. And what we start to see is that people lift more. And ultimately, just so everyone can wrap their head around, the thing we really care about is I can objectively measure your range of motion. I'm a physical therapist. That's what I can do. And I can measure your output. Everything else is slave to those things, is in service of those things. Full stop.
Yeah, I was just commenting about the output thing today, that with sensors and everything else going on, it's so easy to get wrapped up in all these other adjacent metrics, which can be super useful. But I've lost track of even people have emailed me just reams of data. And I'm like, okay, so you're on a rower. What was their output of this thing you did? Oh, I don't know. I forgot to look. So like output and range of motion, like even if you only know those two things, you don't have any other surrogate markers, you can get really far with that, but you kind of need both of those to start.
Go ahead.
I was just going to give kind of a 50-year-old exercise lady example of this,
Yeah.
especially with respect to Kelly's archetype model. We obviously owned a CrossFit gym for almost 20 years, and I understand programming. But my goals as a 50-year-old female exerciser are to keep my muscle mass, and I love mountain biking, so I want to be able to continue mountain biking. But when I think about my programming, the most important thing as I look at my week and my days are, am I touching all the positions? Am I touching all the archetypes?
This is the most romantic thing you've ever said to me.
I know. So if yesterday I put my arm over my head, then maybe today I need to put my knee behind my butt. I mean, it's just this very simple way of thinking about it. And I think for your sort of average, everyday middle-aged exerciser out there, it's important to bring some attention to the fact that most people listening to this are probably just doing one or maybe two of those movements and skipping out on these huge swaths of the other things that the body needs to be able to do. And you may not want to access it now, but you might later. And in 2 years, you might determine that you have a love of pickleball and you haven't touched that shape for the last 20 years because you've just been Pelotoning.
Oh, you're going to touch it.
And you're going to touch it, and then you're going to touch it in the ortho's office, right? And Kelly can get all deep and technical about the archetype model and all the specific things that the body's supposed to be able to do, but it's actually pretty simple. Your joints are supposed to be able to do some real basic things. And I think about, okay, in my own simple way of programming, did I put my joints through all of the possible ranges of motion? And you can do that in a 7-day. I only really do like strength and conditioning training 3 or 4 days a week because I like to mountain bike. So in those 3 days, I'm able to hit all those shapes. And that's how I design my program. All these people are like, programming no, I just design my program around, am I hitting all those shapes?
And it
works pretty well.
And what you can do then is suddenly recognize, if we take something like a basic squat shape, right? Everyone can relate to that. I think everyone agrees that you should probably squat in some form. Well, the way we only typically load it, and the language, I think, where it's right now happening in strengthening, let's not call it strength and conditioning. We're on it in the durability, longevity sort of space. It's all about muscle mass, right? Dumb muscle mass. And hey, we just need to get muscle mass on you and load you so your bones are big and you have this metabolic. That's not true,
because Galpin says it's about strength.
I know, but still,
Galpin's always the exception.
Yeah.
But Galpin would say, so those things correlate roughly.
Yes.
But what I'll say is, Galpin also knows it's about coordination of that. And I think, quoting Franz Bosch, is that strength training is just coordination training with resistance. And when we begin to pull all of the skill out of the strength training, resistance training, what we end up with is sort of imagine a bodybuilder just jumping into an MMA ring. And I use that analogy because we saw this TV show recently called, the Fit 100? It was that Korean show.
Yeah.
Right. Did you see it? It was so
No, I haven't. I got to watch it now.
It's on Netflix. It's like the Fittest 100. It's great.
They took 100 athletes over Korea, from South Korea, from MMA fighters to CrossFitters to Olympians and Navy
dancers. I mean, like any.
And they just had them do some, if you've ever CrossFit before, you'll be like, oh, this is very CrossFit. And some functional tests and hold this over your head. And the most jacked guys
died early.
They died, of course, because they couldn't put their arms over their head. They weren't very fit.
We don't want to spoil it for you. They made it a little wild, but
they look great, right? But what you see is the expression of all that ends up sort of falling on its face. So if your goal is to look great, that's fine. That's a fine goal. But when we're talking about strength and conditioning and not just dumb musculature, what Juliet is pointing out is suddenly we can say, well, there's a lot of ways to put your arm behind your back. You can bench, you can dip, you can push up, you can do chaturanga, right? You can push and pull from those positions. You can approximate the joints or compress the joints or distract the joints. But then I can add load, I can add speed, I can add reps, metabolic volume. I can also add cardiorespiratory demand. And so suddenly, if I can change the movement learning, the motor learning parameters. And so instead of a bunch of block practice, you get more random practice. Suddenly I'm like, Juliet and I are competing for world champion of the world. And there's a little time stress. And boy, that changes everything. I just went unconscious and all of a sudden started moving like a jerk to try to beat Juliet. And so suddenly what we recognize is, and our model is, hey, we're really looking for you to be able to express fundamental patterns. And again, those are the expressions of what the body should be able to do, but just given a formal language of strength and conditioning. And they should be relatively stable movement patterns and strategies across these different domains. And so that means, hey, you can't do this air squat with your heart rate at 180 and a little bit of fatigue. Chances are that's not a really great, well ingrained movement pattern, right? You may not be as strong with your heart rate at 180, but you should move relatively the same way. And that's where this kind of conversation about living forever and just putting muscle on has nothing to do with high performance or actually getting someone to the pickleball world championships.
Well, and the other thing I was going to say, another way to think about this is, why are we here? And we had Katie Bowman on our podcast, and we're big fans of her and her work. And she was just talking about how the body, whatever you're practicing is the shapes that your body adopts. And unfortunately, most of us are practicing sitting for most of our days. And when you're practicing sitting, your joints are all at 90-degree angles all day. And that's fine. We're not anti-sitting. Sometimes people think we're like the anti-sitting people. We're not anti-sitting. We like sitting. We're fans of sitting. But I think one of the reasons we love this kind of training we do and thinking about putting our body into all these shapes is that we want to make sure we're practicing something else besides sitting and practicing all of the shapes. Because if we just practice sitting all the time and then we try to access these shapes that we haven't been practicing, it becomes really difficult.
Practice doesn't make perfect. Practice makes permanent.
Yeah.
When wrapping this back into sort of a metabolic conversation, we want people to understand, again, around performance and nutrition, we should see changes in your output, right?
Yes.
I think that's the problem that people sometimes forget. Like they get on a diet and it's about body composition. That may change your output because you're generating more force at a lower body weight. But ultimately, we're interested in you handling higher loads, higher volumes, and reducing that, what we call session cost. That's our phrase for limiting sort of the total physiologic cost of the training and sort of your adaptation response to it. And what we find now is that no one can outwork anyone else. That ship sailed in like the 90s. Oh, I'll just do my secret squirrel program and get more volume.
Yeah, that ship
Juliet.
sailed when the CrossFit Games
Yeah.
became a thing.
Right. There's just so much. People are all trained, or the Tour de France, or we got access to, we just saw suddenly that the volumes that people are handling. So we're always looking at how do we allow athletes to handle more volume? And I think that's what sometimes gets lost in this conversation among experts, is that all of us aren't playing defense. We're playing offense. We don't say, do this because you may not go into the shoulder on the ditch. We say, do this because you're going to go faster down the freeway. And when you end up in the ditch, you'll end up back on the freeway faster. And here's an example for everyone. I love dessert. I have loved dessert and have had a romantic relationship. It's the second woman.
Primarily it's primarily the cookie. That is his.
Cookies are great. I love cookies.
Yeah.
And here it is. For the last 2 months, I've given up all sugar. And when I say that, I mean refined sugar dessert. Like people are like, you're not eating fruit. I'm like, stop being a child. Of course I'm eating fruit. Right? But what I stopped doing was eating candy. I stopped eating dessert. I stopped eating
No gummy bears?
None of it. It's all gone right now.
I know.
And what I'm running is an experiment.
He's barely alive right now, Dr. Mike. He's barely alive.
My A1C was fine. My homocysteine, fine. Those things were fine. Why? Because I'm checking. It's objective, right? What I'm interested to see is, can I actually feel better and go better as a 50-year-old man? And I'll tell you what, pulling the sugar out, I feel like I found another gear. Because my body.
Well, hold on. I'm going to tell you what his new gear is. That Kelly we track our sleep on an Oura Ring like everybody else. And he definitely does not historically sleep that well. But he also historically eats dessert right before he goes to bed. And in the last 2 months, he's pulled dessert out, and his sleep score, he's not just pulled the dessert out, but he's pulled out eating close to bed.
Interesting.
And his sleep scores have dramatically improved.
Heart rate variability has improved.
Yeah, his
resting heart rate down 2 beats.
Yeah, so it's been really interesting to see that. And who knows whether it's probably more likely to just be that he's digested his food when he's gone to sleep, whether or not it's sugar, who knows? But just that alone has been a major difference.
And then chances, those are still analogs.
Yeah, but then who knows? Because maybe tomorrow when he sleeps well, he slept well last night. So maybe today, 4 o'clock, he won't have as strong a desire to eat sugar because he got such a great night's sleep.
I never had a desire to eat sugar. I just chose to eat sugar.
Don't even, except for you chose to eat it every day.
Just 500 or 750 calories of additional.
Yeah.
If it fit in your macros, right? I've heard that before.
Yeah.
And oftentimes it fit in my macros. What I'll say is I definitely had bigger shoulders on the road than everyone else. I'm 240 pounds, under 10% body fat. I have gigantic hamstrings and quads that can soak up that glucose.
I don't think Dr. Mike is a small man.
No, I'm not saying he is not a small man. What I'm saying is, for me
You
personally,
got lots of
David,
big sinks there.
yeah, I had
Yeah.
a bunch of big sinks.
Exactly.
And yet, what we're interested in is, hey, I'm starting to look at what happens when we make a change. What do I feel? And that's where all of this comes. Do you think my tendons and ligaments and joint surfaces are going to likely handle larger loads because I'm not having to sort of manage that sugar bomb? Probably.
And because you slept well.
You got it. So I think that's this really interesting interface of all of your life's work. And again, I think I appreciate that you are such a performance coach. That's how I would describe you to my friends.
Oh, thank you. I
Also,
appreciate that. That's
who
very
is
high
not,
praise.
who also is an expert in nutrition. And I think though I might be an expert in movement who has a minor expertise in nutrition, right? What we're seeing though is all of these things are important. And when people come to us and ask us which one of these things is not important, we're like, which hand do you not want? You know?
Yeah, but I mean, at the same time, I think one of the challenges, and especially because there's so much easy access to information now, is that, again, those of us that live and breathe what we're talking about, it's easier for us to have a 20-item daily to-do list of health behaviors that we check off. But for most people, that might be 5. And how do they choose which things are essential? And that's what we're trying to help people figure out how to do is okay, there's 1,000 things you could be doing, from taking supplements to certain types of exercise to tracking things to certain diets. I mean, there's 1,000 things people could be doing. And those of us who do this, we have maybe a bigger capacity and ability to choose 20 things each day, but most people have 5 things. And so what Kelly and I have been trying to do lately in life is help people figure out, like, what are those 5 things that are going to move the lever the most. And it turns out this, like, not eating late and not eating sugar thing may be like really a key thing for Kelly, because if it means that he sleeps well, and to us, sleep is a keystone behavior and that impacts all and positively impacts all other health behaviors, man, that could be a really big lever for him.
Yeah, and that's what I think having professional help in any sort of imagine that could be obviously why we're doing this, could be a book, could be hiring, people such as yourself, that it helps you figure out where the next action needs to go. Right. Because the reality is people could do a bunch of different things. And could it make a big difference? Sure. But the question most people want to know is, hey, I only got time for 2 more things. My life's crazy. Like, what has the highest leverage for those 2 things? And I think any professional can look and go, okay, how's this? How's this? How's that? They may not be exceptional in one area, but like in your book, they can go through and look, okay, do you have these kind of basic movement patterns? How's your breathing? What's your basic nutrition, sleep, etc.? And sort of the filtering mechanism I use for that is as survival. So I think your body is just intrinsically wired to survive as best it can. So the top of my list, which would be breathing, and then actually I would have, Kelly would like this, hip extension and hip flexion, because you have to be able to ambulate. Like the joke I make is, if you could walk around, you could probably still get food and find a way to feed yourself. If you can't have hip flexion or extension, let's say without technology, man, it's going to be a lot harder. It's going to be really hard.
You have no idea how happy that makes Kelly. Like, he's so happy right now. He feels seen as a human.
I want people to hear that when we look through this hierarchy, through this lens of 2.5 million years of evolution, then it really does hint at what are essential behaviors. Turns out sunlight is super important.
Definitely.
And I think what that makes it easier to understand is, okay, how am I disrupting sort of this base programming that's existed for a long time? And I'm not pining for the old days of dying of a tooth abscess.
Yeah, and like eating locusts for dinner.
I originally, when I was like, Juliet, I heard this diet called the paleo diet.
This was like in 2004, by the way.
Maybe in 2003, 2004. And Juliet was like, hey, I just Googled that. And I don't know if Google was around. You're like, I Yahoo'd that. And you were like, the first thing that came up was fermented wasp nest soup. I think you're full of shit.
Yeah, I was like, I don't know if this paleo diet thing is going to work out for us, Kelly, because we're never going to make fermented wasps' nests.
And I was
We
like,
can't even say the words.
I think what it means is that we're supposed to eat more food again, like that we cook. That's what I thought it meant. That I think when we look through that lens, suddenly it becomes, what are the keystone behaviors? Well, it turns out, for example, everyone loses their mind about walking. Well, I'm an athlete,
Yeah.
walking where, and I'm like, well, it turns out you used to probably walk 6,000 to 8,000 steps a day, no matter what, just
Or
Yeah.
16,000.
right somewhere in
Yeah,
that
if
range
you're
at your
Amish,
minimum
it's
to
up
your
in the
maximum.
high 18,000, 22,000 a day because
That's
you didn't use
right.
technology.
So if most people are walking 2,000 to 3,000 steps, we know that to be true, then we can ask, does that have an impact? Was that important? And what we see is, well, our lymphatic system doesn't work as effectively. We don't load our joints. We're not outside getting sun. We're not in nature. We see this sort of cascade of downstream effects from the simple idea that, hey, it's a lot easier not to have to walk anywhere today. So now we have to be more formal about asking people to move their carcass in space, right? Pilot this meat mech around so that your body can do what it's supposed to do. We did a interview with a friend, and I suggested, wait for this, this is going to blow your mind, that our minimum is trying to get 7 hours of sleep. We really think that that is a good basement, especially if you want to change your body composition, grow a body, get out of
Recover
chronic pain,
from pain,
recover.
surgery.
And you're shaking your head inside because you're like, 7, good luck with that. I mean, that's going to make it, the tolerances get real small. The magic starts to happen when you push towards 8, right?
Yeah, 8 or 9 for some people even.
Right.
Which nobody wants to hear.
No, and we had, I don't know, it's 500,000 views on that thing, or no, 3.5, 4 million views. And the hate that we got.
Oh, yeah.
Where people were like, what would you even do with all that sleep? I mean, all the people who are rich only sleep 4 hours. Don't be a sucker.
All the
And we've
outliers, the deck 2 mutants.
Right.
You know what I really took away from that experience that we're watching that whole Instagram post go down is just this reminder of how siloed we all get in our communities and how
totally.
Kelly and I are no exception, that we live and breathe in this health, fitness, wellness, whatever community, however you want to describe it. And so saying you should get 7 or 8 hours of sleep within this community is pretty well accepted at this point. I think everybody is tracking in this community, a lot of people are tracking their sleep or have at least tried tracking.
Yeah, I was feeling gaslit. Like I was like, am I being gaslighted? I had to go up and do the research again.
Yeah, but what we realized is we just stepped 1 foot out of our own silo, which I think is really important to do in all ways in life, is just to step a little bit out of our silo. And we realized that, man, like we sort of have assumed this is, everybody gets it, that this sleep thing is well understood. Well, man, it's not. Like those of us who live in this silo, we have so much more work to do from an education standpoint. We just need to step a little bit out of our own universe and start getting these messages out to people. I mean, there's a lot of work to do there. That's what we really learned.
Yeah, I still try to keep a couple, I would say, just kind of general population clients, because just for that matter that it's so easy with more higher performing clients where the small things make big differences and they've got most of the basics down. Not all the time. Granted, there's a lot of, like we've talked about before, elite level athletes that eat like a floating trash bin fire and sleep 6 hours a night. There's always exceptions to
and they're
things.
Still world champions.
Yeah.
And they still destroy people, which is crazy. But even just that, just getting education and talking to people about, my client once a couple of years ago, she's like, yeah, you'd be so proud of me. I had a high protein breakfast. I'm like, oh, this is so cool. What'd you have? Like, I had an egg. I'm like, an egg? Like a single
just
egg?
one?
She's just, yeah. And I'm like, well, it's better than the half piece of toast you had 2 weeks ago. But she thought that was like the pinnacle. She thought, I've made it now. That's 7 grams. I'm good to go for the rest of my life. I'm like, well, it's better, but
gone from 0 grams of protein a day to 7.
Right, to 7.
It's an exponential increase.
And really, I think where Juliet and I have been led, like everyone else in our field, is saying, well, how do we set up the environment so the person can do it without thinking? How do we, and we call that environmental constraint. And we originally, when I was a young physio in school, we did a bunch of work with the occupational therapists with people who had cerebral vascular accidents and strokes and head trauma. And someone would come in and they'd have a deficit in their sort of affected limb. Let's say it was like their left hand. And what they would do is they would go ahead and put like a a cooking glove, like an oven mitt on the less affected side.
Yep.
So if my left side is more affected, right side is less affected, which is the right terminology for that, everyone. Not good side, bad side. And what
Correct.
they would do is suddenly make it so it was really difficult to use the easy side. And it was really, I had to focus intently on redeveloping those motor patterns and practice with the more affected limb. And that was an idea called constraint. And I came home and I was like, Juliet, we have to just take the cookies out of the house. Because if I can't get the cookies, that's the same thing as putting an oven mitt on myself. And we started applying that more and more to an exercise. How might we get a better cueing or an automatic better physiology or expression of the physiology through our movement? And a good example is the burpee. We see people very meticulous in their exercise and their complex movements, and then as soon as they do a burpee, it's just a trash fire. They just flop to the ground, overextend, no butt, right? Land with like foot in a crappy turned out arch collapse position and jump from that position. I'm like, okay, we just did 100 repetitions of practice undoing all this foot pressure balance work that we've been doing. And when we just said, I was like, great, you win feet together burpees. And so you now have to land with your feet together. And guess what? We suddenly didn't see any of that silliness. And so that environmental constraint led us down to these ideas of how can we set up the environment and where might a person have agency in the day so that they can live their lives and not feel like they're dumping 90% of their available RAM into this idea of how do I manage? I have to eat 2 eggs, Dr. Mike? That's insane.
Yeah.
But I mean, I can't emphasize enough how Kelly and I operate our good health practices are operating on autopilot because we've so carefully set up our environment to make the way that we shop for food, the way that we exclude certain things from our house. I mean, we've become known as like the standing desk people and wrote a book about standing. And we're not necessarily fans of, like I said earlier, we're not like fans of standing over sitting. But what we like about standing is that it gives you movement options. You're more likely to move around and leave your desk and fidget and do all this sort of like little micro non-exercise activity movements. And there's 1,000 ways, if you look at our house and our office, that we have set up our environment to make it so that it is without thought to make the right decision, completely without thought. And that's really the goal. So yes, we have to be intentional. We go and actually exercise, and there are some things we have to really think about and be intentional, but most of the health practices we do are literally built in because we've created an environment at our house and our office to facilitate that.
Yeah, I teach coaches and even clients. I call it like rigging the system in your favor.
Yes.
Yeah.
What are you going to do to make it easier? Which is why I'm a huge fan of like fasted cardio stuff. Yeah, there may be some metabolic benefits that we could have a long drawn out discussion about body composition changes, fat use, etc. But the biggest reason is for most people, it's just easier. Get up, go for a run. If you're a runner, go for a walk, get on the rower, get on a bike. What do you do beforehand? Nothing. It's low intensity. You probably don't need much of a warm up. What do I eat beforehand? That's fasted. If you want, drink some water with electrolytes. Like you've just simplified so many questions and so many other steps beforehand, because if there's 17 steps to do before they do the thing, the odds of them doing the thing just crash.
Yeah, right. If you have to have a perfect meal that has the perfect macro count and you have to make sure to eat it an hour and a half before you train so that it's fully digested, it's okay, yeah, no one's ever going to exercise again.
Right.
I love that. I don't think I've ever thought of it that way. And I think that
it's just like the barrier to entry.
Yeah. And I'm like, just so we're clear, that's not the same thing as competing in a World Cup final. I mean, where need this, and I know you're not ensuring that, but I think that's where sometimes the messiness is that, hey, this thing that we're doing can be scaled up. But if you're going to do 3 sessions today, we need to make sure you're fueled. But if you're every once in a while, I'm like, hey, here are my physical goals now. I want to be less gross for my wife. Less gross. That's a technical term. And I want to be the most badass 50-year-old middle-aged guy in my neighborhood who can like mountain bike when his back doesn't hurt like that. What am I really training for? And you're absolutely right. Sometimes we get so precious because it makes us feel like that misplaced precision. I have the right goo and gel and bar. And I'm like, dude, we're riding for mountain bikes for an hour. It doesn't matter what you're doing. Stop it.
Yeah, like we're not trying to win. Kelly and I are not trying to win mountain biking. Who is it that said we don't nature for time? Who said that recently?
I like that.
Yeah, it was like, we're just like, we don't nature for time. Like
Shout out Nicole Christensen.
Yeah, we do. We like to do outdoor activities because they bring us joy and it's part of our community and we get some exercise on board, and we are not trying to win mountain biking at all.
Yeah. And that's why going back to output, to me, output is a differentiator. So if someone comes to me and says, this happened recently, I want to qualify for the Olympics as a rower, right? So we're going to use a 2K on the concept 2 as a thing. And then it's a series of all these highly in-depth questions. And my first question was, what's your 2K time? Like, you send me a 2K time because I need to know, are you up at that elite level where these things are justified, or are you not? And then it's just, let's just start here. Let's just make it more simple. You don't need to have the exact precision matrix meal 2 hours before this and your caffeine down to the milligram. But the output will tell me kind of where you're at and the order of priority then at that point. So
Tom Pidcock is arguably one of the greatest cyclists around today. We're in peak biking, like where you can just, these men and women are just casually jumping in and winning a cyclocross world championship, then riding the Tour de France, and then coming back to the
and then
mountain biking.
winning an Olympic gold medal in mountain biking.
It's been, I mean, I really, everyone, what's happening in cycling right now is
cool.
It makes Lance Armstrong look like old
just
school.
boring.
Just
boring.
That slow old guy.
Yeah, and, he did one race a year.
But Pidcock found, and he talks about his breakfast. He's on race days, I eat 3 scrambled eggs and 100 grams of rice. And literally it's the same thing. And he just figured out, oh, that works. And I'm comfortable, and I don't have to think about it now because I've just found my pre-race meal. And maybe it was 200 grams of rice, or
whatever.
But the idea here is that he knew roughly what was in it. He knew he could always get it. It was easy to digest, and it didn't mess with him. And he just worked that piece out. So then the real thing, what matters most, not did I have this, because it feels, I think one of the things that we're always trying to have people understand is we want to move beyond this idea of plausible deniability. And plausible deniability in sports means that I can turn around and be like, but Mike, look, I took my CoQ10 and I sprinkled it on my Mike Flakes and it didn't work. And you can point and say, well, it wasn't my fault. Or you can say, look how hard I trained and it's not my fault. My knee hurts or my back hurts or I couldn't train because look at my volume. And so it gives us a way of looking back and saying, well, my result can't be my fault because I did all of this very precise work or very intentional work instead of seeing it for what it is, all in service of, can I show up when it matters and do what it matters? And now we're into all the performance aspects of it. We're just talking about trying to get your body prepared to the line.
Yeah. And I think, as you guys know, at the high end, like what I do with people, once they're like super dialed in, and I just fuck with them. I try to pull stuff out. I want them to be as resilient as possible to not have that excuse on the day. Oh my God, you had 50 grams of rice instead of 60. You'll be fine, but let's test that and make sure that you can handle these small amounts of variability. Because you guys know that stuff's going to happen. If you compete long enough, you're going to miss a station. Shit's just going to happen. And I think the more elite level athletes are prepared both physiologically and mentally to handle that, and it doesn't derail them, where some people are so dialed in that they become very fragile, and usually you see their training is amazing and their competitions are dog shit, right? And to me, that's the transfer got missed. So those people need more distress just thrown at them in training. But again, people who are general population would look at that and be like, oh, well, I should be able to get away with this. No, this is an elite level person, and we're doing this on purpose. This doesn't mean you should go back to having 4 donuts for breakfast.
Yeah, I mean, we laugh. This is kind of a joke, but we've become so dialed with our sleeping situation, Dr. Mike, at the Starrett house. We found the chili pad years ago, and it kind of changed Kelly's life because he was such a hot sleeper. And we take the perfect dosage of magnesium, and we sleep with eye masks and earplugs. And we have this whole setup, our sleeping setup is pretty sweet. The drawback of it is we definitely are less flexible when we try. And
I found that with my sleep too.
Yeah, I mean, we go to hotels and we're like, yeah. You should tell about, how I'm talking about the cow, practicing with Lenny, where they're getting coaching and learning, but when they're stressed and tired during games. So that's what I was thinking about when he was talking.
Oh yeah, one of the teams we work with, regularly, everyone can do everything fresh. And one of the ways that we regularly mess with athletes is ask them to perform very precision, high skill, high outputs when they're metabolically trashed.
Yep.
And that might be consciously. Can you pick up? Can you see? Or do you have the peripheral vision in these team sports? And it's an art and science to do all of this. But I think you're absolutely right that we're looking for how can we reduce the variability. So when our athletes travel, we try to have them at least take their pillow and an eye mask. So they're sleeping on the same pillow. They get the same sets of smells. How can we set the temperature? How can we control for the room? And everyone, how that scales up is that now some of the teams in the Tour de France, every athlete has their own mattress. Every athlete has their own washing machine. And we just start to say, well, where's the variable where we can not end up putting the car in the ditch because we got sick or we got one bad night's sleep, which put us in the hole versus, and I think you're absolutely right. The central conversation is what is output? And if the output is, I just want to feel better, that starts to become a lot more simple. Well, you didn't eat fruits and vegetables this week, or you didn't, and you didn't go in any sunlight. We just had the founder of a company called Nature Dose on. And Nature Dose is an app that tracks how much time you're actually going outside.
And it's really cool. It's cool. And I recommend you download it. It's free. And they've done this amazing job basically tracking the entire contiguous United States. And they can tell if you have, as long as you have your phone with you, they can tell whether you're inside or outside. And it's really interesting to see.
Average American is spending 120 minutes outside.
A week?
A week.
Whoa, that's so much worse than I thought.
It's way worse. 120 minutes.
And that is actually also includes kids as well, which is sort of extra disturbing because you think, man, okay, at least as adults, like we have this excuse of we go to work and we have to be in offices and whatever. And I know kids go to school, but I think people would think that kids were getting more time outside, but they're not.
I went outside for probably less than 3 minutes yesterday.
Yeah.
No, we walked to get a coffee.
So you were outside for 15 minutes?
Yeah, it's max.
Yeah.
And so it's easy suddenly when we create these benchmarks, vital signs, then you're like, whoa, I blew it. And tomorrow I'm going to do a little bit better. And I think as everyone in sports science, performance therapy knows, we're really interested in trends. Show me what your sleep latency is, or show me what your sleep time is, or your trend of your sleep density. We need to see those trends over time. You can literally have a baby, never sleep for a year and come back and win a world championship. We see that all the time, right? Your body can handle that, but you can't do that forever and not pay a price. And I think that's what we're expecting. Well, I took this vitamin and I listened to this podcast and I don't understand. Why didn't it fix everything?
Yeah. And I think that's what also makes physiology difficult, because you as a human organism can absorb a fair amount of stress, even if you're kind of half off the rails. But at some point that has a limit, right? So people think, oh, well, I didn't sleep well last night. I got through today. I didn't sleep well the other night. I don't really need sleep anymore now, right? And then all of a sudden something crashes and they're like, I can't figure it out. I went for 2 or 3 days without much sleep, and now a week later I'm a mess, right? It's the brain is just so stuck in these linear patterns that things that are non-linear, it's hard to see. But I think the benefit of having some data is you can go back and look. I do this with heart rate variability all the time. Here's your graph of stress. Here's your graph of hours of sleep. And right. And you see hours of sleep go down, stress goes crazy. And I literally just take a picture of the graph, send it to clients and go, what do you think's going on here? And they literally look at the graph and they go, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that sleep impacts my stress that much. This is so crazy. Because they knew it, they understand it, but when they're forced to see the trends of the data, again, back to their output, all of a sudden, oh, okay, now it becomes a lot more real at that point.
And we just wish we could get some kind of data like that around people's musculoskeletal pain and injury or proclivity to injury. There are some genetic markers and stuff for pain, but we've seen that so often over the years, and with our work and with Kelly's, clients, is the amount of people who come in and they're like, well, I've been running like this every single day for 20 years and I didn't tear my Achilles. And it's, well, at some point The body was like, this was the last step you were going to take in that shitty position. And now your Achilles is going to fall off with that nutrition, with the lack of sleep and whatever. Right. And so it's, man, if we could just sort of like rewind in time and have some sort of like picture we could send to people that just said, hey, you've run with this crappy technique with no sleep and no fiber in your body for 20 years. This is where you're headed.
We had a woman in our gym who had a broken foot, and she did a lot of exercising with a boot on for a long time because we had to protect that. It was a bad break. We just kept training, and she got out of the boot and full return to sport. 3 months later, she's wearing the boot again, and I see her just on the assault bike, super bummed.
She looks so sad. She has one foot up. She's doing 3-limbed assault biking.
And I go up and I'm like, hey, what happened to you? Are you okay? What's happening? Tell me what, like, why is the boot back? And she's like, nothing. My dog died. And her brain was so stressed that it's reimagined and interpreted what was this healed foot, and all of a sudden her foot started hurting again.
Yep.
And that's why, for everyone to hear this, that we want your brain and your brain tolerance almost to be at the top. If I have a person who feels safe, feels seen, is well rested, is stoked, that person can tolerate way more shit than someone who is not. And I think suddenly you're like, okay, what does that mean, Kelly? Well, it means you have to pay attention to what you eat. You have to pay attention to how you sleep and how you downregulate. And did you get sunshine? And do you have meaningful relationships? And suddenly what we see is that we have a brain that will put up with a lot more silly crap. And all of a sudden, though, when that knee flares and you can't tell the number of sort of noxious inputs into the system that have arrived for your brain to say, we're going to pay attention. I'm going to get your attention now with this pain signal. I think that's where the narrative gets lost a little bit, is how people kind of think about, well, if I'll just take this supplement or I'll move from this secret scroll program to this secret scroll program, instead of saying, let's put the nervous system first in the order of magnitude of things we need to work on.
Yeah. And if someone asked me what kind of my ultimate goal for people is, independent of performance, would actually be, secretly, I'm trying to make them as resilient as humanly possible.
Love that.
But nobody, maybe this happens to you guys too, nobody comes to you for that. It's kind of getting there a little bit more, but nobody comes in and goes, I just want to be as resilient as possible. But all the things they talk about and the things that they do, they are kind of asking for that, but they don't have the language to it. It's, I want to do this output, but I want to be able to do it kind of on less work. It's like for body composition. Like the question no one has ever come in, but they really want to know for general population is, how shitty can I eat and how little movement can I do and still look good? Right? That's kind of what they're asking for. And again,
what's
we
the
all know
cheapest gas can I put in the car?
Right.
What are the crappiest tires I can go
Right.
and race with? And I think that is a reasonable approach, because you don't care until you care. Let me tell a story where I'm a young physical therapy student in the hospital watching an open heart surgery. It wasn't open heart surgery. I saw those two, but I was looking at someone who was getting some plain old coronary artery bypass grafts, right? They were doing that. They were putting some stents in. This guy was very heavy, very successful, had the most beautiful family of all time, owns a house in Pacific Heights in San Francisco, like a partner at his law firm. Every metric on the planet is killing it, but cannot change his coping mechanisms, manage his stress. And he ends up putting himself into this position where he may die if this intervention doesn't work. And his whole family is just stunned to see this happen. And if that guy has every resource available to him and the most amazing family ever and all of these things and ends up there, that tells you how hard it is to change and how wired our brains are. And I don't even know did those interventions change him? He was like, I got to get religion. I got to start. Probably not. He probably was like, well, I'm good to go now. Let's keep drinking and doing all the stress coping mechanisms. And I think that stuck with me about how hard it is to get people to care, and why we really do want to try to say, what's important to you? Let's go there and get that goal, because a lot of other behaviors will sort of dovetail into that.
Yeah, no, I love that. And it goes back to me, like output again. Yes, if you want better body comp, cool. Even with physique competitors, great. I get it. That's what you're graded on. You're going to be on stage and basically your underwear. But even then, on a daily and weekly basis, we're going to track your performance. We're going to track these other metrics. We're going to track some form of output. because that's what's driving all these other things. And we can see small changes in that too, where body comp, what do we have to do? Toss in an MRI every 4 weeks or something to even see changes? You'll notice them over time, but day to day, week to week, it's really hard. And as if you're trying to get someone to change, if they don't see any difference, ooh, that makes it really hard to sustain that momentum just to get them there long enough to get those habits somewhat on autopilot.
Why am I doing all this algebra? You're going to need it someday.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why like the greatest gift for nutrition coaches is that people lose some early water weight when they start
Sure.
changing their diet and they see something change on the scale. And it's, man, if that didn't happen, people need a little feedback.
Or yeah, how can we measure output? And again, I think it really comes down to this output piece. And then really is pretty remarkable when we start to see how the pieces interact. And I just want people to understand that is something that we are feel very strongly about. And it's why if you're going to have a human performance conversation with someone, we have to be talking about these different aspects. If I'm going to ultimately talk about your ability to extend your hip in the bottom turn of a surf in the world championship, we're looking at who can do this the longest, the most efficiently, the most powerfully with the least cost. That is a worthy conversation, comma, how do we take those lessons and actually transform our own families?
Yeah. The very last point as we wrap up, I love the constraining the environment, because I always look at principles that transfer across multiple domains. To me, that's the definition of a true principle. And you go back, you mentioned like Franz Bosch, like the whole ecology of movement, the whole setup, the movement parameters for what you want to happen, and then have the athlete express within those parameters versus I want you to do X movement, internal cues, external cues. But the longer I study movement, the bigger fan I am of let's just set up the environment, give the athlete the task that we want to do at a high level, see what happens. And then let's not maybe adjust this minute stuff, but let's constrain the system a little bit different to get a better output. And then let's try to get some reps and some repetition there. And if you have a hard time eating cookies all the time, then that means maybe moving cookies out of your house for a while. Doesn't mean never have a cookie.
That's
or,
right.
Or like I'll do is put them in tinfoil and put them in the freezer. They're still here. I could still get them if I need to, but now I have to unwrap them and they're frozen and they're just not quite as good. It's more effort, so I kind of don't eat as many.
That's exactly right. And everyone, just the Franz Bosch example is he does a lot of work with a water bag behind the neck. And by putting the water bag behind the neck, you force the torso to be upright. You force you can't just get away with being a noodly torso and do something. And most sports need a little bit more upright torso. And that's an example of we're going to have you do all of these complex things or seemingly complex things, but all the while your torso is going to have to be upright and you're going to have to manage that. So that's a great example.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Really appreciate all your time. And where can people find out more about the book and the website and just all the wonderful stuff you guys are doing?
Sure. We are on Instagram at The Ready State, and you can learn about all of our sort of musculoskeletal stuff on thereadystate.com. And the book you can get anywhere people buy books, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all the places, and also learn more at builttomove.com.
And if you want to see how effective your training program is, run it against anyone else's training program. And if you think that your system is the perfect system, go ahead and take your self-test on our app, and we'll see how your movement minimums are working. We've got a really great self-mobility test there that can help you understand the blind spots that you probably have in your programming.
And where do they get the app?
It's in the App Store and Google Play Store. It's just called the Ready State Virtual Mobility Coach.
Ready State Virtual Mobility Coach. Awesome. Well, thank you both so much. I'd highly encourage everyone to check that out. I love the book. Thought it was great and huge fans of all your stuff. And thank you so much for all your time here. Really appreciate it.
Nice to see you,
Dr.
sir.
Mike.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for listening to this excerpt here on the podcast. This is an excerpt from the Flex Diet Virtual Metabolism Summit, which is going on February 9th through the 12th, 2024. You can still get access to it at www.flexdietsummit.com. That has all the information there. And if you go there before the dates of February 9th through the 12th, you'll be able to get access to all of the talks for free. Just sign up there, and we have a virtual play of all of them over that weekend. If it's outside of that time, or you want to purchase all of them for download, you'll be able to do that there also. So thank you so much for this special excerpt of the podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. I will talk to all of you next week, and hope to see a fair amount of you at the virtual summit coming up. Thank you so much.
You know something? That was a sweet number.
It sure was.
You know something else?
What?
I hate sweet numbers.
This podcast is for informational purposes only. The podcast is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. You should not use the information on the podcast for diagnosing or treating a health problem or disease, or prescribing any medication or other treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider before taking any medication or nutritional supplement, and with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on this or any other podcast. Reliance on the podcast is solely at your own risk. Information provided on the podcast does not create a doctor-patient relationship between you and any of the health professionals affiliated with our podcast. Information and statements regarding dietary supplements are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to therein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician.